On December 7, 1943, General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, received word from President Franklin Roosevelt in Washington. Roosevelt had just returned from the Tehran Conference where he had met with Churchill and Stalin. The message was clear. Roosevelt had made his decision about who would command the invasion of France. The choice would determine how the war ended, how many Americans would die in France, how many months the fighting would last, and whether Soviet tanks would stop at Berlin or roll to the English Channel. Marshall understood the weight of what was being decided. This wasn't just about selecting a commander. This was about choosing between military efficiency and political necessity, between the general who could win fastest and the general who could hold the alliance together. For months, everyone had assumed Marshall himself would get the job. He was the obvious choice as Army Chief of Staff. Since 1939, he had built the American military from 200,000 men into a force of millions. He had planned the global strategy, selected the commanders, and coordinated operations across 2 oceans and 3 continents. Churchill called him the organizer of victory. The invasion of France was the culmination of everything Marshall had built. Roosevelt wanted Marshall to have the command, but Roosevelt also knew he couldn't spare Marshall from Washington. The global war effort depended on Marshall's strategic oversight and his ability to manage the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As Roosevelt told Marshall, "I didn't feel I could sleep at ease if you were out of Washington." So the choice fell to Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower. He was currently serving as Allied commander in the Mediterranean. He had never commanded troops in combat before 1942. He had spent World War I training troops in Pennsylvania. His entire career had been staff work, planning, and political coordination. But he was cautious, diplomatic, skilled at managing egos and building consensus. Roosevelt's decision shocked many officers. What about Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., who was commanding the 7th Army in Sicily? Patton had an exceptional combat record. He had saved the North African campaign after the Kasserine Pass disaster. He had taken Palermo in 38 days when British commanders said it would take months. He had won every major battle in North Africa and Sicily. His troops called him Old Blood and Guts and would follow him into hell. German commanders feared him more than any other Allied general, but Patton wasn't even considered for Supreme Allied Commander. He wasn't in the conversation. He wasn't on the list. Despite being America's most successful battlefield commander, despite his tactical genius, despite his proven ability to win battles faster than anyone else, George Patton was too politically toxic to be trusted with coalition command. This wasn't because of the slapping incidents that would become public weeks later. This was because Marshall, Eisenhower, and Roosevelt all knew something the American public didn't. Patton could win battles brilliantly, but he couldn't manage allies. He couldn't control his mouth. He couldn't subordinate his ego to diplomatic necessity. He saw coalition warfare as a competition where American forces should dominate and British forces should follow. He treated war correspondents as tools for personal publicity. He said offensive things about allies without considering consequences. Patton was an operational genius, but Supreme Command required more than operational genius. It required managing Churchill's pride and de Gaulle's ego. It required building consensus among officers who disagreed about strategy. It required making suboptimal military decisions to preserve coalition unity. Patton couldn't do any of this. He didn't want to do any of this. He resented having to do any of this. So Roosevelt chose Eisenhower, and Patton would spend the war executing other people's plans instead of making his own. He would command armies brilliantly within strategic frameworks others established. He would prove repeatedly that his aggressive tactics could have ended the war faster, but he would never have the authority to shape grand strategy. Roosevelt and Marshall had made a political calculation. They chose the commander who could manage the coalition over the commander who could win battles fastest, and that calculation would cost thousands of American lives over the next 18 months. This is the story of why George S. Patton, Jr., the greatest American battlefield commander of World War II, was never even considered for supreme command, not because he couldn't win battles, but because winning the war required more than winning battles. It required coalition politics, and Patton was incapable of understanding that political compromises would take priority over military effectiveness. To understand why Patton was passed over, you have to understand who George Patton was, not the Hollywood version, the real man and the real problem he created for the Army's leadership. George Smith Patton, Jr., was born in 1885 into a wealthy California family with deep military roots. He attended West Point and graduated in 1909 with a reputation as an aggressive, competitive officer who believed war was mankind's highest calling. In World War I, Patton commanded tanks and was one of the first American officers to understand mechanized warfare. Between the wars, Patton studied military history obsessively. He read everything written about Napoleon, Hannibal, Caesar, Alexander. He believed he understood warfare at a level his contemporaries didn't. He believed he had been reincarnated from previous warriors and had fought at Carthage and Troy. He told people this. He believed it absolutely. His personality was complicated. He was profane and quotable. He wore custom uniforms with polished boots and ivory-handled revolvers. He demanded perfection from his troops and drove them harder than any other American commander. He was theatrical and knew it. He cultivated an image as a warrior poet who loved battle. He was also deeply insecure. He had severe dyslexia and struggled with reading throughout his life. He compensated by memorizing everything. He studied obsessively because reading was difficult for him. The aggressive persona was partly real and partly constructed to hide his learning disability and his fear that other officers saw him as intellectually inferior. By 1942, when America entered World War II, Patton was 57 years old. He had spent 33 years in the Army training officers in armored warfare and writing doctrine manuals for tank combat. He understood mobile warfare better than any American commander, and he was absolutely convinced that he was destined for greatness. The problem was that Patton couldn't control himself. He said what he thought. He insulted allies. He ignored orders he disagreed with. He leaked information to reporters to build his public image. He treated war correspondents as tools for his publicity. He competed with other generals for headlines and glory. Most importantly, Patton had no understanding of coalition politics. He didn't care about British sensitivities, Free French pride, or Soviet demands for a second front. He cared about killing Germans efficiently and winning battles decisively. Everything else was politics, and politics bored him. Marshall knew all of this. Eisenhower knew it too. They had worked with Patton for decades. They knew he was brilliant on the battlefield and catastrophic in a headquarters. They knew he would win battles and lose allies. They knew he was the best combat commander America had and the worst possible choice for a position requiring diplomatic skill. So they made a decision. Use Patton where his strengths mattered, keep him away from situations where his weaknesses could destroy the alliance. Give him armies to command. Never give him theaters to manage. It was a rational calculation based on Patton's demonstrated behavior, but it was also a decision that would haunt American strategy for the rest of the war. In November 1942, Patton got his first combat command of the war. He led the Western Task Force in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. His forces landed at Casablanca in Morocco, while British and American forces landed further east at Oran and Algiers. The Casablanca landing was complicated. Vichy French forces were defending Morocco, and the political situation was delicate. Roosevelt didn't want to alienate French forces who might join the Allies. Patton was ordered to minimize casualties and avoid excessive force. Patton ignored the political concerns and focused on military objectives. He hit the beaches hard and overwhelmed French resistance in 4 days. Casablanca fell. French forces in Morocco surrendered. Patton established himself as the American commander who got results, but the real test came in March 1943. American forces in Tunisia had been badly beaten at Kasserine Pass. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had smashed through American lines and exposed the inexperience of U.S. troops in combat against Wehrmacht veterans. American casualties were heavy, morale was shattered, and Allied commanders were questioning whether American forces could fight effectively. Eisenhower needed someone to restore order and confidence. He sent Patton to take command of Second Corps. Patton arrived on March 6, 1943, and immediately transformed the unit. He enforced uniform regulations, demanded discipline, and court-martialed officers for cowardice. He personally visited frontline positions and fired commanders who weren't aggressive enough. Within 2 weeks, Second Corps was a different army. Patton led them in attacks at Algeta where they stopped a German counterattack and inflicted heavy casualties. American troops stopped retreating and started winning. Patton had proven that American soldiers could fight. They just needed aggressive leadership. But Patton didn't just win tactically, he won psychologically. He restored American pride after the humiliation of Kasserine. He showed British commanders that American forces could hold their own against German veterans. He demonstrated that speed and aggression could overcome Wehrmacht tactical superiority. Marshall and Eisenhower took note. Patton was proving himself invaluable as a battlefield commander. But the North Africa campaign also revealed the political problem with Patton. He competed with British commanders for glory. He resented taking orders from Eisenhower. He gave unauthorized interviews to reporters. He complained about supply allocations. He made it clear he thought he should be in command of the entire North African theater. Eisenhower had to manage Patton constantly. He had to smooth over conflicts with British officers, explain away Patton's public statements, and balance Patton's tactical brilliance against the diplomatic headaches he created. Still, the results were undeniable. Patton had taken a defeated, demoralized corps and turned it into an effective fighting force in 2 weeks. When North Africa fell in May 1943, Patton's reputation as America's best combat commander was established. The question was what to do with him next. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. Patton commanded the U.S. 7th Army. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded the 8th Army. Eisenhower commanded the overall operation. The strategic goal was to secure Sicily, knock Italy out of the war, and prepare for the eventual invasion of France. The plan gave Montgomery the main route north to Messina. Patton's forces were assigned a supporting role protecting Montgomery's left flank. It was a conservative plan designed to let the experienced British forces lead while American forces learned. Patton hated it. He saw it as British arrogance and Eisenhower's unwillingness to trust American forces with the main effort. He decided to ignore the spirit of his orders and race Montgomery to Messina. If he got there first, he would prove American forces were superior to British forces and establish himself as the dominant Allied commander. Patton drove his troops relentlessly. He advanced up the western coast of Sicily while Montgomery's forces got bogged down in the east. Patton took Palermo in rapid succession. He pushed his divisions forward with minimal rest. He accepted higher casualties to maintain speed, and on August 17, 1943, Patton's forces entered Messina hours before Montgomery arrived. It was a stunning tactical achievement. Patton had covered more ground, fought more battles, and reached the objective first. He had upstaged Montgomery and made American arms look superior to British forces. American newspapers celebrated him as a hero. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He was the face of American military success. But the Sicily campaign also revealed Patton's recklessness. He had pushed troops beyond their physical limits. His casualty rates were higher than necessary because he prioritized speed over careful planning. He had created a competition with Montgomery that strained the alliance. And worst of all, his aggressive driving of tired troops created the conditions for the incidents that would nearly end his career. On August 3, 1943, Patton visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia. He was touring the facility and talking to wounded soldiers. He approached Private Charles Cool, who was sitting on a bed with no visible wounds. Patton asked what was wrong. Cool said he couldn't take the shelling anymore. Patton exploded. He called Cool a coward, slapped him across the face with his gloves, pulled his pistol, and threatened to shoot him. He ordered Cool back to the front lines immediately. Medical staff had to intervene to prevent Patton from shooting a soldier suffering from combat fatigue. 1 week later, August 10th, Patton visited the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. He encountered Private Paul Bennett, who was also suffering from combat fatigue with no visible injuries. Patton repeated the performance. He slapped Bennett, called him a coward, and drew his pistol. He had Bennett thrown out of the hospital tent.